One more plug, right? We've been talking about this, announcing this, January 2nd. I say mark your calendars, but it's Sunday, you'll be here, right? But just a reminder that we're going to be doing a walkthrough and explanation of the vision for the upcoming year here at the congregation. So that is definitely something to look forward to. I am excited to be here tonight. I appreciate Scott letting me take his class while he is gone on vacation. We have a lot to cover, and I don't know if we're going to get to it all. But there's your assignment for next week. And tonight, we are focusing on chapters 29 through 33 of the book of Jeremiah. And before we get started, so I had this up. This is an exciting class because I don't know to what extent we've talked about this in here. So far, everything in Jeremiah has been very doom and gloom, right? It's prophesying about the punishment that is to come for the disobedience, for the continual disobedience. But tonight we're going to talk about there's hope. There's a glimmer of hope, and we're going to get into that in the chapters we look at tonight. So the question to get us started is, can you think of an example of time that was tough for you, that you were given a bit of hope, and that really, how did that impact you? How did that motivate you to deal with that current situation? Anybody have any ideas, thoughts?
I worked last year, most of the year, and then they called in October that, okay, I got something. I'm like, okay, it took not too much I could get to it, but at least knowing that, there was hope for a paycheck,
Yeah.
kind of, they would kind of get through the wait.
That's a good point. And I think that's one a lot of people have experienced when it comes to jobs and pay. And you're right, just having that little glimmer that something's coming here, that can help kind of sustain you. Anybody else? Mike?
It appears to me that God does not protect any of us from circumstances. But He does protect us while we're in circumstances.
That's a good point.
So,
Yeah.
there's all, if you have that mindset, then you have the hope.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a really good point. Just a quick reminder, so as we move into chapter 29, just a quick reminder, we are in this where Jeremiah doesn't necessarily follow chronologically with each chapter, both what we talked about last week and get into this week. We're in this portion of Zedekiah is king. He's going to be the final king before Jerusalem is sieged, and we're still in that time period with Zedekiah. So before we get into chapter 29, and I have a lot of thoughts here, I want to know, those of you that read ahead or are just experts in the book of Jeremiah, what do you know about, what stands out to you about chapter 29? And I'm really looking for just phrases, quick sentences, very high-level stuff that comes out of 29. What are some quick hitter thoughts that you know that you remember about your reading of chapter 29? Anything come to mind? False prophets, yep. And that's a continuing theme, right? That's not just in this, but you're right, there is multiple rebukes and punishments for false prophets. Phil?
I love verse 11, where it says, I know the plans that I have for you, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope, which goes to that first question you gave us.
I'm sure glad I don't have a slide with specifically that verse on it, because that would be awkward that you just stole my thunder. But yes, verse 11 stands out. It's a verse that if you were not familiar with the book of Jeremiah at all, you've probably seen somewhere or come across. So again, that idea of hope we start to see manifest. Mike?
Who is God addressing at this point in time?
Are you asking me, or is that the...
He's addressing the remnant.
So...
Because back in 23, he says there's going to be a remnant.
The letter is written specifically to be read to the exiles, right? That are there in Babylon. But your point is well taken. God's will reaches.
And the other part of it is no one that was exiled got to pick who was the remnant God picked.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so let's get into chapter 29. So we do see that at the very beginning. And by the way, we're going to spend more time in 29 than 30 through 33. Not every chapter gets equal distribution. It's just the way it works. We'll spend most of our time here. But so we know it's a letter written from Jeremiah at the beginning of the chapter to the exiles during the reign of King Zedekiah. And some of the things we see here, let's take a look at, I'm going to pull out certain verses that I want to read and then make some comments on. And you're welcome to comment as well. But let's look at verses 4 through 7 here. So verse 4 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city, where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your own welfare." My dad was in the Air Force, and as we were growing up, so we were always in different locales. And I always remember, for some reason, as a kid, you know, you'd box up what you had and you'd take it to the next spot, and there were certain framed art in our house that stood out to me. There were a couple different ones. One was always that said, "Home is where the Air Force sends you." And then the second one was, "If you can't bloom where you're planted, grow where you're stuck." Sometimes those are your circumstances, and you got to make the best of them. And I don't know if my mom put those up there or not, but that just stood out to me. It was always there. Does anybody remember last week in chapter 27, anybody remember the focus of chapter 27? What was the theme of 27? As it relates to Babylon. God was telling them to do what? To submit. Yeah, submission. Not only Nebuchadnezzar, but he tells them, not only Nebuchadnezzar, but his son, but his grandson. They're going to rule all nations. I almost get the idea of when we think about kicking against the goads, right? God has this path. He knows it. He sees it. And they were trying to steer off, and they were trying to kick against that, and it was going to cause them some pain. But it was submission. Think about, look at verse 6, when he talks about taking wives and take wives and have sons and daughters and multiply. They had to be, they had to be either of two mindsets. Either one of them was, oh, so we're going to be here for a while, right? This is a long-term plan you're giving us. Or the other group that didn't believe in Jeremiah, which is probably most of them, was saying, I don't need to worry about this. This is short term. But have you ever had that dawn on you where, you thought something might be easy, you thought it was going to be short-lived, you thought it was just going to be for a moment, something you were planning to do, and then something happens, and before you know it, you realize, okay, I'm in this for the long haul. It's a bigger project than I thought. Maybe your wife asks you, hypothetically, I need you to go get something tomorrow. She asked you before bed, I need you to go get something in the morning, run to the store and just grab this, whatever it might be. And you wake up in the morning and ready to run out and do this. You see the list, and it's multiple items, and it's multiple stores, and you realize, like, before you even get your first cup of coffee, that your day has changed significantly. That game that you wanted to watch, you're planning on, DVR, because you're not going to watch it in real time. Your expectations for your time have been reset. And to some extent, I think that almost could be when you're hearing this and you're saying, okay, we're talking about generations here. We're talking about kids having kids. It's a long time. This is serious. Verse 7 here, it talks about the welfare of the city. This is God saying, pray to the Lord on its behalf, on the behalf of the welfare of Babylon. They're instructed to pray for it. That reminds me of 1 Timothy chapter 2. Paul writing to Timothy in instructions for the church when he says, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good, and it is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of truth. So my question here is, do you think God is telling them to blend in, to become like the Babylonians? I mean, you know the popular phrase, "When in Babylon." Like, what is he? It's a phrase, right? Do you think that's what he's saying here?
Sounds like he wants them to be better.
Okay. I think he still does have higher expectations for them, absolutely.
Before they were taken to exile, they were told the unpatriotic thing of give up. So there would have been this fervor of, we're going to fight because we're going to win, but the actual truth was, no, you're going to be taken into captivity. Well, once they get there, then the idea is, we may be here for a year or two, but we're going to do everything possible to resist this and go back immediately. And so God says, no, you have to submit to the mindset of, you're stuck here for 7 years. You are just, so instead of a resistance movement, you need to have a city you're in mindset, which is totally against the gut feel of what people want for themselves. And so that's the idea he's still trying to get is, you have to just humble yourselves and submit to a plan you don't want. And so create get lemonade out of this instead of just dealing with it.
Yeah. And remember, I think at the beginning of the chapter, it addresses who this is to. It calls out artisans, craftsmen. Like, this is a skilled labor force that has come over, that's there. They have an opportunity to contribute to the welfare of this city. But God's saying to them, you're tied to this city now, whether you like it or not. So, as you said, make the best of your situation. Ideally, you're still living a godly life. We know that wasn't happening, but I think that still obviously is an expectation. I mean, I think it's important. It tells them, do not decrease. God's plan was never for his people to kind of wither on the vine. He doesn't want that to happen here. And that's important because we're going to get to the hopeful portion of this here in a little bit. But compare this group to, like, say, their Exodus ancestors, kind of where they were. You think of that group that came through the Exodus. They saw God's power. They were initially grateful. They complained a lot along the way. But even complaining shows a level of care. God did not want them to interact with foreigners when he went into the promised land. Remember that? He didn't want them to take anything early on. We see that in Jericho. And he didn't want them to be introduced to those corrupt ways. Bad company corrupts good morals. This group of people, they were way past that at this point. They already had the bad morals. I mean, this was a group that they were coming to worship God on one day, and then they were going to worship other gods outside of the temple, and some were burning children on another day. And they were this was almost an apathy towards God. I think it's for the phrase, the opposite of love is not hate but indifference. They didn't hate God. They didn't love God. They didn't really even fear God. It was just kind of an indifference. So this group of people, they didn't just need to be gently corrected back on the right path here. They needed to be shown they didn't even remember where that path was or what it looked like. And so as part of God's plan here, he reminds them that life cannot simply grind to a halt during troubled times. And obviously that's a lesson for all of us. Mike, did you have something?
If you elevate yourself to 40,000 feet, and God's higher than that, he has a divine timeline. And starting in Genesis, that timeline is heading towards a certain phase of the moon in the future in a Passover, where Christ is going to die on the cross. The Passover is in danger in Jeremiah. And if there's no Passover, there's no crucifixion and resurrection. So, what I see here is he's adjusting his people, corrective discipline, so to speak.
There were so many times in this, when I'm reading this, when I thought of the parent-child relationship.
Yes, it's corrective discipline, the whole thing, none of it's punitive, it's corrective. I mean, punitive is, wiped off the planet.
Yeah.
Corporal punishment. But this is all corrective, and he's setting everything in place right here for Calvary.
Yep.
That's what's happening. That's what I see.
I would agree.
I think you would kind of, wouldn't necessarily blend in, but to still keep their identity as, Israelites, as Jews, but build a community where you are. You're stuck there, you might as well make the best of it, you might as well go ahead and, reestablish who God's people are.
And it was tough to do that because of the next point, because we read of this major theme that's in this chapter, but it's also a reoccurring one in Jeremiah, and that's this idea of false prophets. Listening to false prophets that were there with them in Babylon, telling them it's not that bad, it'll be over soon. Why? This is almost a rhetorical question, but I'm kind of driving at something. Don't listen to false prophets. Duh. Why in this case, beyond just the simple because they are not speaking for God? Why in this case was the false prophet message damaging to God's plan?
End up dead.
Yeah, well, they end up dead, absolutely. One of the things we're going to talk about is this idea of hope. False prophets are selling false hope. It runs counter to God's larger plan. They're predicting peace when God's prophets have been prophesying war and punishment for discipline, or punishment for disobedience since, how far back do you want to go? And we're going to touch on Moses' very similar words back in Deuteronomy. This has been the message forever. There's no easy way out of disobedience. We remember, it was at the end of chapter 28, Hananiah, false prophet. He was the one that came in and said, no, in two years everybody's going to come back. He took the yoke that was on Jeremiah and threw it down. What happened to him? Remember? He died. God said he was prophesied he was going to die, and I think it was, within 2 months, or a month later, he died. That's the other thing you see about these false prophets in this, is that they are dealt with pretty swiftly. I thought about this false hope and how it damages kind of the larger plan. Like, again, going back to the parent-child thing. If your child kind of blatantly disobeys you over and over again until you've just had enough, you say, I'm putting my foot down. You're grounded for a month, no electronics, no after-school activities, just straight to your room. If I wanted to punish Tate, I would take away, I'd take away food, but that would be really harsh. But he just eats constantly, so maybe I'd limit him to 3 meals, and that would be the punishment. But just like, it's severe. You're going. This is it. And your spouse goes to them and says, while they're in the room, and says, this really isn't so bad. I think your dad will change his mind. After he cools down, probably let you out of your room in 5 to 10 minutes. You've given him hope when he doesn't really deserve it, and you're undermining the intent of the punishment that was originally there. The intent was to bring him to a place where he is sorry for what he's done, to have a change of heart. By stepping in and sending that message, you've derailed that completely. You've given him a false hope. And in these verses, it talks about, don't listen to the dreams of these dreamers, I think is how it's phrased, at least in my version. Any thoughts on this section?
Against the idea that you're under the authority.
Yep.
In this case, you're actually under the authority of God. Really, because,
Moving on to this next section that I have for verses 10 through 14, and Phil called this out. There's a bigger section here, right? There are several verses that are really, really beneficial here. I remember this, though, specifically as a young man, this verse having an impact on me. And it was a time where most of my friends were getting married or were married. I wasn't, and probably I didn't have any prospects either. I had a lot of struggles with professionally what I wanted to do. And it was just that point where I was like feeling a little bit helpless. And this verse, this idea just really, really helped me. Was a time for me. I hope to know that, to remind me, I knew it already, but to remind me kind of very succinctly that God had a plan for me, right? That there is a hope for me. There is a future for me. That there is a God that cares about me and is looking, might not be on my timeline, but it's there if I'm willing to kind of abide in that timeline and up until that point do everything I can do, right, in a godly manner. So this was really helpful to me. But all this is conditional, just like everything else that God does. It's conditional, right? He will offer us the opportunity to live with Him in heaven, but it's conditional. What is this what are these sections? What are some of those conditions that this section points out?
If we seek Him, we'll find Him.
Seek.
When we seek Him with all of our heart.
Yeah, so we have to seek Him. We have to take that step forward. It says, when you call upon me, when you pray to me, when you seek me, and not only when you seek me, but when you're fully invested, when you're all in, when you seek me with all your heart, you're going to find me. I will be known to you. And again, we start to see that message of hope. Steve?
The thing that strikes me about verse 10, let's see, is it verse 10? Sorry. Oh, yeah. Where he says in 70 years.
Mhm.
Psalm 90, I think also verse 10, talks about God declaring that the lifespan of man would be 70 years.
Okay.
So if you think about the Israelites as a precursor to Christianity, they were in a land that they didn't belong for 70 years, and then they got to go to Jerusalem. And we are in a land where we don't belong, and in 70 years we'll go to the New Jerusalem. So all of the messages of hope that are being spoken or written to the Israelites are the same messages of hope for us. And the way that they're being told to behave in this land that they don't belong is the way we should behave in this land that we don't.
Yeah, I mean, the parallels are really interesting as you read through this. Hope is just such a powerful motivator. You think about, and again, I come back to my kids. It's important. I can't continually call out my kids for things they're doing wrong, even if it's warranted, even if they are doing something wrong. I can't keep beating them down with that, unless I also offer a glimmer that I also love you, or it will get better, or you will learn this. There has to be some hope there. Raising them in a hopeless situation, we've seen that kind of play out. And so just that glimmer of hope allows them to progress, to move forward, to move beyond disobedience, to move beyond struggles that they have. Any comments about that section?
The studies kind of almost remind me of when God said in the wilderness 40 years to punish those who had, complained, but then still had hope for their children that they said would die, gave them hope that they would inherit the promised land.
Yeah, just because your parents blew it, there's still hope. You're still my people. Yeah. Okay, this next section here, 15 through 19. Did I miss anyone? Any other comments? 15 through 19, we see this idea that the exiles are looking to false prophets that are there in Babylon. We also see that those that remain, that are still in Jerusalem, they're not out of the woods yet. Beginning in verse 17, it says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, I am sending on them sword, famine, and pestilence, and I will make them like vile figs that are so rotten they cannot be eaten. I will pursue them with the sword, famine, and pestilence, and will make them a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth, to be a curse, a terror, a hissing, and a reproach among all the nations where I have driven them." So war is coming to Jerusalem. They're not out of it. This sounds so much like Moses talking about the results of disobedience in Deuteronomy 28, verse 36. And he says, "The Lord will exile you and your king to a nation unknown to you and your ancestors. There in exile you will worship gods of wood and stone. You will become an object of horror, ridicule, and mockery among all the nations to which the Lord sends you." So again, this message has, there are consequences for disobedience. And there's only so much there's only so much warning the Lord can provide before correction needs to be taken. Any thoughts on this? So by the way, this is, we're within, I hate to say dates here, but Zedekiah rules, I think, 11 years. The siege takes place in his 9th year, and then the city falls in the 11th year. So we're a few years away from this happening, but Jeremiah's telling them that war is coming here to Jerusalem. And then the last section here is, again, it's more punishment for false prophets. He mentions several of them, but he mentions 2 of them, Ahab and Zedekiah, familiar names but different people. He even has a curse that will be named, that they will, there's a curse that it's like, what was it? You'll be like, the curse would be like, you'll be like Ahab and Zedekiah, who were, I think it says burned, right? Or something like that. Were you mouthing it? Did you know it, Mike? I thought you knew about it. So, they're going to be delivered over to Nebuchadnezzar, and according to the curse, they end up being burned. Again, swift action for false prophets. We're introduced to another one, Shemaiah, false prophet in Babylon, who is actually writing back letters to Jerusalem, claiming that God has made him a priest, and he's advocated to the priest Zephaniah for Jeremiah's imprisonment. Basically, he's writing back to Jerusalem saying, God made me a priest. You need to lock up Jeremiah. And then what happens to his family? God doesn't allow him or his family to see the hopeful future that he has planned for them. Again, action is taken to address these false prophets, because they're constantly trying to undermine the bigger plan that God has. Any comments on this chapter as a whole?
23 is the indictment. Verse 23. This is God's indictment. They have done disgraceful things in Israel. They committed adultery with their neighbor's wives. And, this is the third one, and have spoken lying words in my name, which I had not commanded. He said, indeed I know, because I'm a witness.
Yeah, I was there. I know. I heard it. Yeah.
They do get shit.
It does.
Josh, I'm continually reminded about the theme through all of this, that's all through the Bible about hearing the word of the Lord. I mean, this idea of the word of the Lord came, did you hear, did you listen? It's just repeated, Old Testament and New, and just how crucial that is, that we just don't hear it, but we listen to it and obey it, because at some point, we want God to hear us and hear our petitions,
Yeah. All right, we got a few minutes to go through 4 chapters. So we saw some hope there, right, in 10 through 14 of chapter 29, and 30. So actually, time-wise, this 30 and through 33 were written a few years down the road. Jeremiah is still in Jerusalem, but it's a few years down the road. But it's still a message of hope here. this is God's kind of promise of restoration after punishment. We talked about like the passage in Deuteronomy and Moses talking about what was going to happen. We had this covenant that the Israelites made, a promise way back in Moses' day. If they were loyal to their God and to each other, he would bless them. He would make them his treasured possession. However, if they rebelled and did not keep his covenant, he would turn his back on them, at least kind of temporarily. So we read the passage from Moses, what he said he was going to do to those that were coming into exile. And then in Deuteronomy 30, verse 2, it says, "And if you return to your Lord, your God, and obey him with all your heart and soul, according to all that I command you today, you and your sons, then the Lord your God will restore you from captivity, have compassion on you, and will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you." In verse 8, I just want to pull out this one verse from this chapter. "And it shall come to pass in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke. I will break his yoke from off your neck. I will burst your bonds, and foreigners shall no more make a servant of him. But they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them." So it's interesting. Like Isaiah, Jeremiah also associates events of the near future to those of the distant future. Anybody done any mountain climbing? Some? You get to the top of a mountain. If you're at a mountain range, you get to the top of a mountain and you look over it, and those other peaks, they look very close, right? You look like you could almost kind of throw a rock and hit one of them. Reading these prophecies, it's like looking at kind of several peaks in a mountain range. From a distance, they look as though they're next to each other, and then when they're actually really miles apart. And here we have, obviously, a reference to the Messiah to come. That's chapter 30. I'm assuming you read it. It's gone. But it's very hopeful because it talks about God's restoration of the people. Chapter 31, God's promise to rebuild the nation, but also make it better. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." So whereas the first covenant was written on stone tablets, broken by the people, this new covenant would be written on the hearts, and its foundation is Christ. Very similar to the language in Hebrews 8 where we read about Jesus, the high priest of a better covenant. And that was 31. 32 is really interesting. So we read about hope. We read about what's going to happen for the better, for the future. And then in chapter 32, Jeremiah decides to buy some land. And God tells Jeremiah that he'll be offered land in Anathoth by his cousin and that he should buy it. It's his right of redemption by purchase. It's his to do this. It's bought for 17 shekels. He gave the sealed and unsealed copies of the deed to purchase to Baruch to store in a jar for safekeeping. Anything seem strange about this scenario, aside from the fact that he's just taking a break from his day job to buy land? Anything else stand out to you?
If there's this great army coming, I don't want to piece of land that there's going to take from him.
So technically, this is taking place when the war is already going on. They are sieging Jerusalem when this is happening. This is in year 10 of Zedekiah. So the war has been going on. They've been pounding the walls of Jerusalem for about a year now. And this takes place. Jeremiah is also it's an interesting note that he's kind of under house arrest at this time as well. But what is important? Why is this interjected in here? What do you see? What's the message here? Jeff?
They're coming back.
Yeah, it's hope again, right? They're coming back. Why would purchasing land in Judah be important? Because he's going to get access to it one day. It's a sign of hope. God's telling, because God told him, your cousin's going to come and offer you land, and when he does, buy it. And that's what he does, while the war is going on. It's really interesting to think about it from his perspective. Let me make sure I got the right passage here. All right, so let me move. This is moving on because we got about 4 minutes left. This is moving on to chapter 33. And I wanted to read, I want to read 6 through 9 and make an application here because I think it's pretty powerful. In verse 5, we read about God striking down men in anger and wrath for the disobedience that hidden his face from the city. He's hidden his face from the city of Jerusalem because of its evil. And so you hear that, again, you read about the anger, the wrath being poured out. And then right after verse 5, he goes into verse 6, and he says, "Behold, I will bring to it health and healing. I will heal them and reveal to them abundance of prosperity and security. I will restore the fortunes of Judah and the fortunes of Israel and rebuild them as they were at first. I will cleanse them from all the guilt of their sin against me. I will forgive all the guilt of their sin and rebellion against me. And this city shall be to me a name of joy, a praise, and a glory before all the nations of the earth who shall hear of all the good that I do for them. They shall fear and tremble because of all the good and all the prosperity I provide for it." So that's interesting, like one way, because the punishment is met out and then immediately the grace is offered. But the focus is on the city, right, and the people here and what's going to happen. Put your name in that place. I put my name in that place. He'll forgive all the guilt and sin and rebellion that I have against him. And my name will be a joy and a praise and a glory before everyone who hear all the good that God has done for me. It still applies. His love, his mercy, his grace still applies to his people then, to his people now. It's pretty powerful. And so again, that's why I love that there are so many lessons in this for us today. The final part here is there's a section in 33 where he talks about the eternal covenant made with David. He says, "I will fulfill the promise that I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah those days. And in those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land." Again, a reference to Christ. "And then David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel, and the Levitical priest shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to burn grain offerings, and to make sacrifices forever." I'm just blown away time after time with how much punishment can be met with the full amount of anger and wrath, and at the same time exist this perfect willingness to forgive and to bring back. It's hard for us to imagine it, to flip a switch emotionally like that. When you get fired up about something, to also be thinking, that person, I'm so mad at that person. I cannot believe they did that to me. Man, I can't wait till they come back to, I can just embrace them again, and you know, we can be friends again, or family, whatever. It doesn't work that way for us. But for God, it does, and he's shown that time and time again. And that's why we can trust his promises as well, because he's shown it time and time again. We have maybe 30 seconds left. Any final comments? Again, next week is 34 through 37. Zach?
One of the things that when I worked at a corporate job, my corporate boss liked to say to me, "Hope is not a strategy." And that was always something that I understood what he meant, but it was kind of like, that it sort of, I guess, like bad advice. But if you think about what he was saying, I always think what he was saying was, don't wake up to your day hoping something would happen. You have to plan for it. And we do need to have hope in Jesus and in God, but we also have to have faith. And we also have to wake up. We can't wake up every day and hope that everything is going to go right. We have to have faith. We have to understand what God's going to do for us. us, and that sort of goes back to buying the land in the middle of the war, right? Jeremiah believed that God woke up every morning in belief and understanding, and not just, well, we'll see.
Yeah.
So there you
It was-
do have to prepare in your faith as well.
Thank you, Zach. Okay, we will be dismissed. Run, don't walk back to the sign-up sheets and choose one of the adult classes. I want to see everybody's name on that at the end of the night. Thank you very much.